Welcome to the fifth episode of The New Normal by Newsfirst. In today's episode, we'll be exploring environment and sustainability post-COVID-19. I'm joined by three eminent panelists today: Sevandi Jayakodi, Director EFL, Vidura Vadapanava, Environment and Sustainability Expert, and Vinod Malvatta, Executive Director of the Lanka Environment Fund. I'm also joined by Chandra Jayaratna, who will be rapporteur. Before we begin, I'd like to draw the attention of the audience to the Q&A function in the Zoom application at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please do so from there. And please note that if you type your name, I will read it out, but you could choose to remain anonymous. It's entirely up to you. At the very outset of this global pandemic, people didn't know what was causing it. What had they done or who was to blame? A great many people were remorseful for the way in which the environment had been treated and saw Mother Nature slowly begin to reclaim and recover as a result of a few weeks of halted human activity. Having seen some of the obvious benefits of our reduced activity and reduced pollution, including air, noise, and even light, when this global timeout is lifted, Vidura, do you think that everyone will immediately go back to our erring ways?
I think there is a different consciousness that's afoot. I think people's concern about environment is at a heightened stage. The question really is that how much of that consciousness actually translates into action. And we'd be hasty to say that things are going to change rather quickly for two specific reasons. One is we still sit in a infrastructure that was designed in the previous model. So even with new consciousness, until the infrastructure gets upgraded, we will not see major change. Second is that the capacity to change how you function as an organization, as a company, as an industry. I think quite a lot of industries are severely weakened in terms of their cash flow situation at this point of time. So these two, I believe, are going to pose certain hesitancy in terms of changing sentiments actually materializing into concrete action. We will still also at the same time has to deal with the extra precautionary way that we work, which actually adds into the ecological burden. I'll give you two examples. If we use physical distancing approaches for our transportation sector, that would essentially mean that we will have more vehicles on the road as opposed to less, and it will add to the environmental burden. And the second is that all our use of PPEs, quite a lot of it is coming from plastics and the chemicals that we use as disinfectant. And these are here to stay for a long time. So I'm optimistic about the sentiment, but we need to really see how we can collectively put those sentiments into real action that materially changes the way we behave and how we live.
Thank you, Vidura. Sevandi, what about yourself? Do you think that the population is going to go back, or as Vidura said, do you think we're going to potentially, in the short term at least, increase our impact? What are your thoughts?
Nero, I think to start with, we are all talking about going back to normal, but I would like to tell at the very beginning what had been before is quite abnormal. We've been living an abnormal life. This is kind of a lesson for us to understand why it is important to be normal. So if we are talking about going back to abnormal life that we had, I think COVID-19 taught us several lessons, and I think there are positive things as well as negative things. I do understand in order to control the pandemic, we've been using several activities which are actually damaging to the environment, like the use of disinfectants which are not biodegradable, so on and so forth. But at the same time, I also saw some positive things, like people for the first time thinking why this is happening, questioning, and very importantly, science being able to make people listen and act accordingly. I cannot think about a situation where science actually managed to stop all the places of worship. So that means at the moment we are at a very important juncture. So what is important is looking at the lessons and understanding why it happened and where we had been heading, and thinking about, do we really need to do business as usual, or are there other ways, other alternatives?
Thank you, Sewandi. Vinod, what about yourself? Do you think we're going to go back? Do you think we're going to make it worse? What are your thoughts?
It's a very interesting question, Niro. As Vidura and Dr. Sewandi both highlighted, in the short term, we've seen a lot of environmental change, and there's been, social media platforms have been a buzz, I would say, with more people recording bird life or cleaner skies. People seen Adam speak from Colombo, things like that, increased air quality. But a lot of these, if you think about it, are actually more short-term, visible changes that we're seeing. So in order to actually have long-term change, we'd have to look at more systemic changes within the entire structure of things, as Vidura and Sewandi both pointed out. And it'll be interesting to see how we move forward. A lot of the businesses as well as governments, will be looking to return to normal life as well. As Dr. Sewandi pointed out, what we've been living prior to this could be viewed as not normal, especially by people within the environmental field. A lot of environmentalists have been sounding alarms for a long time about this, but the dominant narrative, I would say, has been a different one. So because of that, it would be interesting to see how we move forward into this new normal.
Thanks, Vinod. I'd really like to talk a little bit more about the systemic changes that you think both businesses and governments, as well as individuals, should make. And I'd like to talk about that a little later. Initially there was conjecture about COVID-19 being caused by environmental factors. Being a respiratory illness, some people claim that it was caused by pollution. Although we now know that air pollution wasn't necessarily the root cause of COVID-19, to what extent do you think pollution and environmental factors played a role or exacerbated the issue? This question is to Dr. Sewandi.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting thing because to start with, we were talking about COVID-19 and the link of that to pollution. Well, pollution to a certain extent might have been playing a role, but I think what we really need to use is the word environmental change, because if you look at COVID-19, it's a zoonotic disease. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. Now, if you look at the contagious diseases in the world, 60% of them are actually transferred through animals to humans. And very interestingly, in recent years, more than 75% of the diseases that we've been encountering have been transferred from animals to humans. And why is this happening? This is happening mainly because not that the animals have been entering into the towns and cities, but because we've been more or less moving into their territories. We've been fragmenting their landscapes. We've been creating avenues for animals that are normally not encountering each other to encounter each other through things like illegal wildlife trade and so on and so forth. But at the same time, when a pandemic occurs, the current status of the environment matters a lot. That includes how healthy your air quality is, how good your water is, so on and so forth. So though COVID-19 is not directly due to pollution. I would say it's because of our ill treatment to the nature, especially through illegal wildlife trade.
Thank you, Sevandi. Thank you very much. Vinod, I'd like for you to shed some light. I mean, Dr. Sevandi talked a little bit about the zoonotic diseases and also, the human-animal interaction. Uh, Obviously, things like wet markets and the trade of exotic meats and things like that doesn't help, protecting humans and protecting animals, having, trying to live in this symbiotic relationship. What practical suggestions do you think you could make to the audience at large about that? And also, could you shed some light on, ways in which we could protect, you know, animals and flora and fauna against human interaction?
So, Niro, as Dr. Sevandi pointed out, a lot of animals, the increased human wildlife conflict as well as interaction has caused pathogens to be closer to human populations. So we'll say logging, deforestation, agriculture in close proximity to wilderness areas. All of these activities do put people more at risk. And the wildlife trade, for example, WWF valued it to be between 15 to 23 billion US dollars every year. Sri Lanka, it's pretty rampant in Sri Lanka as well. As you know, pangolins, maybe, if I don't know how many people know this, but pangolins are the most trafficked mammal in the world. And a lot of them also now, it's something that's happening at our doorstep here in Sri Lanka. So in order to look at things like this, the CITES conference is a big one that actually looks at the illegal trade of wildlife and is a global conference that Sri Lanka as well is a signatory. Sadly, we were going to host it last year, and Dr. Sevandi was heading the team in Sri Lanka, but due to the Easter bombings, it was moved to Geneva. But not only ratifying conventions like that, but also really enforcing them is a big step in the right direction. So under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, a lot of the animals in Sri Lanka are actually protected. What we'd like to see, I guess, as an environmental community is the enforcement of that, as well as obviously, reduced deforestation, as well as, so Sri Lanka has also set ourselves goals like move into 32% forest cover by 2030. So it would be nice to see the government actually make some of these goals actionable and take concrete steps in order to reach these goals that we've set. Yeah, so those are some of the main things I would say would help reduce it, and the implementation of conservation measures is, I would say, the number one thing that we need to look at.
Thank you, Vinod. Vidura, would you like to add something to that? I saw you acknowledging.
So one thing I would like to add is that if you look at the COVID and in terms of people who are needing intensive care as well as people who actually succumb to the illness, they quite oftentimes had comorbidities. So there are certain types of sicknesses that actually made it difficult for them to survive. And part of this is actually linked to the issue of air quality, because if you take air pollution, for example, it's one of the leading causes of heart disease. So I think while there may not be a direct link between certain environmental issues to COVID pandemic, there are indirect links that the way the environmental pollution and the way of living had a direct impact whether the patient required intensive care or the patient died. And I want to point out one of the studies, these are still preliminary because the issues are going to go on for a while, was to track the COVID deaths in Europe as a whole next to air quality. And they found out that the largest concentrations of deaths were actually in locations where there was heavy amount of pollution. So initial studies point out that there is a link on how we work, how the environmental conditions are, also directly relating to mortality rate in countries. So I think these are things that we should not take lightly, as well as the links of certain of this environmental pollution and the way we live, creating the kind of conditions that make it difficult for people to survive.
Thanks, Vidura. I also, in preparation for this discussion, I also read the Science of Total Environment journal, which had produced a report on the long-term exposure to air pollution being one of the most important contributing factors to fatality caused by COVID-19, which was, sad to note, but also interesting, in terms of the changes that we need to make to ensure our survival for future. Vinod, you mentioned the CITES Convention, and Dr. Sewandi is wearing a badge. I'm not sure if it's visible to those watching TV, but Dr. Sewandi, for the benefit of the audience, could you tell us a little bit about the CITES Convention and Sri Lanka being a signatory to it?
CITES is a convention that is there to protect fauna and flora, wild species of animals and plants that are traded internationally. Now, this convention is set up to ensure that the trade is sustainable and trade is regulated, and species that are threatened, about to become extinct, are protected from commercial trade. So that the convention operates with a set of schedules, so that we have Schedule 1 to 3. And if a species is in Schedule 1, apart from scientific work, you cannot import or export a species. Other species are allowed to import and export with a permit. So here in Sri Lanka, Department of Wildlife Conservation is the management authority as well as the scientific authority of CITES Convention. And as Vinod said, here in Sri Lanka, we have several species, both plants and animals, that are exported illegally. This includes plants such as orchids, but very importantly, animals. Pangolins are the world's most heavily trafficked animal. We've got several incidences where we have got people trying to smuggle pangolin scales, and in some instances even powdered scales out of Sri Lanka. When COVID-19 started, there were a lot of questions. At the very beginning, there was this discussion that COVID was transferred to humans through bats. And then there was also the discussion whether pangolins were involved in between. Although the science is not very clear, in the past, we know that wild animals have always been linked to the spread of pandemics. If you take Merck, it was because of camel. If you take SARS, it was because of a civet cat. So there is definitely a connection of wild animals. So while CITES has a big role to play, I also agree with the national legislation with a correct implementation of it, and we as laymen, general public, being aware about these things. Because most of the time, there'll be just a person coming to your village, to your doorstep, looking for something which is quite extraordinary. Maybe something as simple as a scorpion. And you would help a person to collect as many scorpions from your village, and you really don't know why they are doing that. But what you really don't understand is, along with these animals, you are actually not just transferring the animal, but also transferring a load of viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens. That's why wet markets and controlling wildlife trade is quite imminent at this moment, just like taking care of the environment.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Sewandi. I think that was extremely insightful and very practicable steps that you mentioned. Vinod, do you think that from a legislation perspective, what do you think can be done to control, wet markets and animal trade that would have more teeth, essentially, than what we are doing right now?
So wet markets, Niro, aren't, we'll say, a huge issue, we'll say, in Sri Lanka. I mean, it's not a, you don't see animals being, slaughtered like that, we'll say, in Sri Lanka, and the consumption of certain animals. Although during the COVID-19 time, there has been a spike in poaching that has happened across the protected area network in Sri Lanka, which is definitely something that is very worrisome. And one thing that we could look into, honestly, is giving the Department of Wildlife Conservation as well as the Department of Forest Conservation more personnel and allocating more funds towards them so they can actually do their job. A lot of them is understaffed. And a lot of money actually doesn't flow back into them, into those organizations. So, for example, SLTDA reported that in 2018, wildlife parks earned a combined revenue of close to 2 billion Sri Lankan rupees, accounting for about 17% of returns within the tourism industry. So if we are to protect our wildlife, we should also look at more stringent measures that actually keep these wildlife populations wild, as well as keep poachers away, and ensure that our protected areas are intact.
Thank you, Vinod. I'd like to talk a lot more about tourism and environment a little later on, so we'll come back to that subject. Vidura, are there any steps or measures that you think we can take in support of what Vinod and Dr. Sewandi have already mentioned? Is there something that you can add?
Not really. I think they're much more knowledgeable on that subject than me. So
Okay. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about CO2 levels and also about NOx and SOx. Since the beginning of lockdown, the human activity has decreased significantly. Air travel has decreased. Commuting to work and so on has decreased. Traffic has decreased. Surely there must have been a positive impact for the environment over this period of time.
I think so. I think there was immediate shift. Air quality actually improved across the globe, that we know from all the air quality measurements. And it happened in Sri Lanka also, but not as much and not as fast as we expected it to be. So that's quite interesting as well. But it's a complex subject because there's quite a lot of atmospheric air pollution traveling that happens depending on the type of wind patterns that we have. While we also contribute towards that, it's not easy to straightforward to say in Sri Lanka's case how this really changed. But let's go back to the original conversation of CO2 before we get to this. The CO2 levels haven't really reduced, even though a lot of the emissions has reduced. But we need to understand this warming and CO2 cycle is much more complex and has substantial system inertia that a single year or half a year or few months is not going to make a huge dent. But if you look at what we are seeing at this point of time, one is that most of world's oceans are quite warm right now, including ocean water around Sri Lanka, which has hit over 31 degrees, and it has been there for a while now. 31 degrees is quite toxic for most of marine species in the coastal zone, especially corals and seagrass beds and other animals who are living there. So we're living in that zone where the survival of these species are directly threatened. And on top of that, when cyclonic activity starts, which is supposed to happen within the next couple of days in the Bay of Bengal, you'll see that warm water actually supercharging that. So these are happening as we speak. Coming back to air pollution, I think the key piece to note is that one thing that's interesting in Sri Lanka's case, in everywhere else in the world, when the economic activity reduced, the fossil fuel burning for vehicles and electricity sector reduced significantly. In Sri Lanka's case, yes, we've seen the vehicle reduction, but we haven't seen the fossil fuel reduction in the energy sector, which is still going at the same rate that it was before that. So that and its relationship to the localized pollution is still going to be there irrespective of our shutdown, because of the structure of our energy system is fundamentally flawed.
Thanks, Vidura. So if I'm just to summarize the first part of the statement, what you're saying is that while CO2 emissions have reduced, the amount of CO2 that we've already emitted is so much that the impact of what we have reduced over the actual quantum of CO2 available in the atmosphere hasn't actually been impacted very much. Is that correct?
Yes, so if you look at year on year, it's still, we are going up by about 2 parts per million, 2 to 2.5 parts per million. So that hasn't substantially reduced just because the economic activity has reduced. But the piece that we are talking about, and there's a cause and effect. I mean, if you use CO2 as the cause, the effect is actually warming. And warming cycle, I mean, this is already one of the warmest years already. Okay, and it's going to top last year as well, quite likely. And the impacts are felt in real life across the globe even now. Look at a very, very warm winter across most of people in UK were doing sunbathing in March. And that's one of the reasons that they couldn't stop the spread, because people were out in the beach and in the parks, and that's not normal. And this type of a shock reduction isn't going to make lasting change. And this is the piece that we must remember, because if you look at what's happening in China now, after all the lockdown, they are really ramping up their manufacturing capacity, and the emissions have increased even compared to last year, right? And moment the rest of the world also opens up, and we are likely to see the industrial production ramping up and the emissions going back to the same scale, right? So let's not be deluded by the little bit of fresh air we have and the emissions reductions as good news stories. This is not a transformation. It's a slight dip.
I appreciate that, Vidura. I think that we are all very grateful for the slight dip. I think that it's a small demonstration of what I think is perhaps possible if we have a will.
Sure. Can I? So let me just say something interesting around that. In my mind, it actually broke one myth, because one of the myths that we held on to is that the economic engine cannot stop for any particular reason, that we are all going to collapse if the economy stops, right? But COVID actually showed this is a myth. Economy can stop. But what we've done, quite interestingly, is privileged human life over economic growth, if I may say so, in most countries in the world. And how many countries do that and how long they're going to do that depends on multiple factors. But it was seen in all the countries in the world. And I think from economic centricity to human centricity is a good move, but it's only a partial move. Where we really need to go to is ecological centricity. And that's where real sustainability comes in. That's where the future of us as a species, as well as ecology, and us as part of a large ecology can survive only when we put the ecology at the center of our thinking. Now, if we were able to do one shift, moving from economic centricity to human centricity, we need to take the second step to really talk about sustainability seriously.
Vidura, I think you're quite right. For a long time, people have prioritized economy over environment, and I do think that COVID-19 has demonstrated that, okay, while economy has been shut down, and it's been difficult economically for countries and businesses to function, survival is still somewhat possible, and it's possible to actually slow let's say deprioritize economy in favor of environment. Vinod, I'd like to talk to you. I mean, you're I would call you an environmental crusader to some extent. is what do you see in terms of the future? Do you think that that companies, that individuals, that governments will take a page out of what Vidura is saying and prioritize environment over economy, or at least increase its priority on the scale?
I certainly do think so, Niro. I mean, for the longest time, as Vidura pointed out, it's been profit, like the three Ps. It's been profit, people, and the planet. And then the humanitarian aspect came forward. So we could say it was people, profit, and planet. But I think now the shift should be to being planet, people, as well as then profit being and the environment not actually being an afterthought, because right now environment is an afterthought when it comes to an environmental impact assessment. It's something it's just a ticket, it's tick the box really. And there have been multiple projects across the globe actually that have gone forward amidst this pandemic time. A lot of things have been passed. A lot of environmental damage has happened on a global scale. I saw a tweet today, I think that the Brazilian president has actually opened up, is revisiting plans to look at the roadway through the Amazon. India has done it closer to home in Karnataka. They're going to be cutting the Western Ghats, which is it's a biodiversity hotspot of the world, and they're looking at fragmenting it through for a road in order for better economic development really. So it would be nice to see a shift in this, but what's needed is a structural change, and environment being, as Vidura so well put it, should be at the forefront really, rather than an afterthought.
Thank you, Vinod. Dr. Sewandi, is there something you'd like to add to the comments that have been made by both Vidura and Vinod already?
Yeah, Nero, there's something quite interesting. Now, we are all talking about money, but when you look at the real value of the goods and services provided by the ecosystem, certain scientists have been really estimating it. So what we know is some of the estimates talk about something like about 33 trillion US dollars as the value of the services and the goods that we take from the environment on a given year. Now, if you look at the gross production of any country, GDP, it's nowhere close to that value. So in other words, in the name of economy, whenever you go ahead and destroy the environment, you are actually destroying your own economy, because the services and the value, the services that is provided by the environment is far more than what we really create. So what is really required is looking at the documentation that is already there, that has very clearly demonstrated that things are not normal and things are not correct. IPBS, interpanel government documentation, has very clearly indicated that if we go on destroying our biodiversity the way that we do, in future there's going to be a collapse, not just in the biodiversity, but also in the economy. Not just the IPBS, but also the post-2020 biodiversity agenda that has come in, has looked at what we've been doing so far, and it has very clearly indicated that we've not done enough to protect our biodiversity. In the absence of biodiversity, there's going to be no economic development. So what we really need to do now is to take this documentation, which is already there, telling us what to do. Let me give you a very simple example. Now, IPBS report, as well as many reports that came up in recent past, has very clearly indicated the need for pollinators, bees and wasps. In the absence of them, there's going to be no production. If there's no pollinators, there's going to be no production. When we had COVID-19 and when we were locked down, at least we had things to consume. Consumption was not a problem because there was enough food. Yet, if we go to a level where there's going to be no pollinators, we are going to be in a greater damage. Therefore, I think what's really important now is to take these documents very seriously and then work out strategically how we are going to come up with a good trade-off so that you have development and ecological development and human development both given due attention.
Right. Dr. Vidura, would you like to add something to Dr. Sewandi's statement?
I fully agree with Dr. Sewandi. The balance. I think the question about balance is where I'm also trying to come at. I mean, I come from a background of corporate sustainability, and it's always the question is how do you think about this balance, right? I mean, our systems, the whole economic model is structured around privileging profit and the financial side of it. And this is the framework that traditionally governments look, not only businesses. So our whole thinking system around how businesses are structured around is to privilege the financial survival. It's not even economic, it's the financial benefit of the organization. So to asking the whole economy to be rethought, the corporation as an entity to be rethought in a context where we are talking about putting correct amount of balance on both environment and social, there is no model for this, right? So if I look at a lot of the conversation that's going around sustainability is not significant enough for the structure of the problem. And let me try to illustrate this in a different way. So we understood the scale and the problem of COVID for most countries, whether they started early or started late, the range of options that was available was literally everything. Right, and we in Sri Lanka, we came out of 2 months of curfew, right, which I would have not thought as possible to put on a country, right? So when we understood that we have this capacity to act, but if we take a issue like either climate change or biodiversity loss, we've never seen that scale of ambition or anything remotely close to that coming from either companies, coming from either individuals or from governments, except for a few isolated cases. So the challenge really is this. We've been talking about climate change, we've been talking about emissions reductions, we've been talking about adaptation, but none of those actions that we've taken have translated into the scale of response that's needed. Right? Now, if you take the 1.5 degree scenario, the amount of emissions reduction, I mean, the whole world has to reduce 4% emissions absolute year on year, right? Nobody's doing this. Very, very few countries are actually attempting to do this. And if you go to UNFCCC and you calculate everybody's INDCs, and you know that you're really never going to hit any of these targets that's spoken about. And it's the same in individual life as well as corporate life. So even the organizations who have very strict climate commitments, we keep asking them, is this reduction sufficient to actually arrest the problem? And think about how governments responded to 2009 economic collapse, and even look at the money that everybody has for stimulus packages. Right? India just gave something like $237 billion stimulus package for COVID. That's the money. You can find the money. And how much do we actually spend in terms of scale onto climate change, which will kill more people than COVID will ever do?
It's a frightening thought. It really is. Vinod, could you shed some light on what Dr. Vidura just mentioned? in terms of how much money can be raised, what's needed. We'd like to have your thoughts.
Niro, let me put it this way. I mean, the government it would be nice to see governments put forward this money. Whether the Sri Lankan government has it is a question that I frankly do not know the answer to. But what we do know is, we'll say, industry leaders, there can be, I'm a strong believer that we'll say revolutions do start from the bottom, we'll say. Ideally it's driven by government change, but we haven't seen the political powers at B from a large scale across the board. It's, as Viduru pointed out, it's very few countries that are leading from example. So it comes down to systemic change from, we'll say, the bottom. People in positions of power, industrial leaders, be it the smallest or the biggest, leading from the front, really. And on an individual level, actually people going out and making changes, whatever small it does, we need to stop with this attitude of, it doesn't make a difference, like my actions don't make a difference. Because if everyone has that point of view, which is more often the case, nothing's actually going to change. During this time, we've really understood that there are so many things that could be deemed non-essential. It's like, do you really need that new pair of shoes you're going to get? Do you really need to go to Paris next year? There are so many things that people have realized, that you don't need. So it would be, from my point of view, overconsumption is the real root cause of the environmental crisis. We keep consuming, and that's what's causing, people keep buying stuff, consumers keep moving things. And the more people demand, consumers will keep pumping out. The production will continue. So how can people stop? At this time, hopefully people did realize that there are so many things that are non-essential, they don't really need in their lives. And hopefully everyone can take a good hard look at themselves and to understand what's actually needed in their lives, and hopefully become more responsible and conscious citizens.
Thanks. It's a very good point. All of the resources that we have, everything that we sell is derived from natural substances. Even what we deem to be man-made material is still derived from a natural material. And we've seen both supply and demand falling during COVID-19. And you're quite right. We've seen people consuming only what they need during this time. And I think it's a matter of producers and consumers redefining the level of supply chain equilibrium, the new level of supply chain equilibrium, so that it is actually more sustainable. Dr. Sewandi, do you think that we can actually get to a point where we are actually sustainable and reach a supply chain equilibrium that is not so harmful?
For a long time, we've been talking about the importance of buying things locally, producing things locally, and being proud of local things. I think when the death came to our doorstep, we really understood it. So picking from where Vidura left, he was talking about the need for raising money. Raising money and governments committing to money for these kind of things are easy, but what is also required is advocacy, even to go local. Because without advocacy, without solid plans to do that, things will be quite temporary. Like, for an example, now I know that everyone are into sort of gardening, and it's quite interesting. That's the way to go forward. But what is also important is the sustainability and viability of such localized markets. So what we really need now is smart investments to ensure that at local level, that we provide the right platform, the right environment for people to buy and also to earn a decent living. We can do that, and we need to do that. Because if you look at carbon emissions, a significant part of carbon emissions are because of transport. And if you look at some of the transport and life cycle assessment of some of the products, it's just really funny. We have cocoa beans produced in one continent, being transported elsewhere to produce it to turn it into a chocolate, and then back again to 5 continents to sell it. Think about the amount of carbon that we emit through that. But can't we do these things locally? But to that, I would also like to add the need of academics. We have academics in universities, and I think now the time has come for us to think about how we can use the knowledge that is there already with us, and also to think how we can come up with startup businesses, and also to encourage people to use the sciences to give solutions for the local problems. So, Nero, I think we can take this trend a bit to the next level, where while promoting local businesses, startups, at the same time creating the right advocacy to ensure that people become buy things willingly, invest willingly, so that all while appreciating the globalization, we should also appreciate the fact that localized small communities can do wonders, and collectively that will create a better picture.
Thank you, Dr. Sewandi. Stemming from what Dr. Sewandi just said, Vidura, I'd like to turn my attention to you. You know, the very act of selling something, even if it's environmentally friendly, or even if it's deemed to be renewable, or even if it's deemed to be a renewable, raw material, it still consumes materials. It consumes energy. It can, so this for-profit capitalistic model, which we have really explored and exploited over the last, I don't know how long, hundreds of years. Is it something that you think is sustainable? How do we look at this model and take some of the things that Dr. Sewandi said? How do we still conduct commercial activity and still, try and harm the environment less? Is it even possible?
I think we need to find a way. I think it's possible, and we are going to fumble around quite a lot. But to find it, we have to have the curiosity and the desire to look for it. And this is something that I see is lacking. It's happening in small communities. It's happening in small communities in all over the world. It's happening in Sri Lanka in communities. It's happening in other countries in the world. But it has not become it has not gained sufficient momentum for it to be more significant than what it should be. The idea of different people specializing and making different products has been there for ages. It predates, and trading it predates capitalism per se. Capitalism has different elements to it, where we've constructed the mass market models, mass market actually selling, construction of the construction of desire on people to mass consume is an innovation of capitalism that has had serious ecological implications for the whole world. The question we have to ask is that how are we going to start thinking about it? And part of the process is to start asking deep questions on why things are as they are, right? And I hope this period of 2 months for us in Sri Lanka, the fact that we had to fundamentally rethink every aspect of our lives, from what we eat, where they come from, where do we get it, what do we do for entertainment, what do we do for exercise, how do we think about our future, our family's economic future. We've actually trained ourselves to ask different types of questions which we would have never asked if this doesn't happen. Now, the hopeful part about it is that questioning doesn't stop just because the curfew is over. that we will ask these fundamental questions. And I want to echo back to Dr. Sewandi's comment on what is the role of academia. And I will also ask a question of what is the role of academia, what is the role of citizen, what is the role of the bureaucrat, and what is the role of a business person. Because if you think about this panel, Niro, we have 3 people who are sustainability specialists in some form or the other. If this conversation is relegated to us and people like us, who are very few in this country, I will honestly tell you, we will not solve this problem. When the business leader, when the CEO starts talking about sustainability, when the politician and the government ministry secretary talks about sustainability, where each and every individual citizen talk about sustainability, when engineers talk about sustainability, that is when things change. And I don't know whether we have good enough consciousness among our community and good enough technical knowledge on sustainability to actually begin that transition. I just hope this approach of asking questions about how we live and our lifestyles, that fundamental questioning, that this will be deep and this will lead more people to think differently. But that's a hope. But and I will ask a question from you as a media and Newsfirst on that matter. How can you facilitate that consciousness emerging? Because we know the power of media in the modern world. And what is your role in creating that consciousness and helping to nurture it so that we start asking different questions, we start thinking about our lives and our development and our industry in a very different form than what we do now?
So, Vidura, thank you for the question. I will attempt to answer it. I think that, the role of the media really is to inform the public. That is its primary function. And this may be only a small step, but it's certainly the first and important step in trying to get that message out there. Having discussions like this without any barriers, without any no-go areas to explore the issues that we are all facing around the world and try and find a solution to those problems together. Because there are aspects that everyone has to bring to the table to be able to solve this problem. So I suppose that business leaders, politicians, citizens, specialists, academia all have the most important role, which is to work together and put their skill sets together in a complementary manner in which we can deliver meaningful change. I think that really is the most important thing for all of us. And before I turn my attention to Vinod, I want to just say that I read a quote which is quite apt at this time, which is that we don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing zero waste imperfectly. And I think that that's what all the panelists are trying to say in different ways, is that we need to get to that critical mass where the impact is meaningful. And my question to Vinod is, how do you get that critical mass? How can we encourage more and more people to participate in protecting what is ours, everyone's?
So one of the things, Niro, that I guess the pandemic has showed us, that the national borders become somewhat arbitrary. The pandemic has showed us all that we're really connected, that everyone on earth, like the global pandemic as well as the environmental crisis, are both really global issues. National isolation can't solve it. It's not, we should be looking towards more cooperation as opposed to competition amongst countries, because right now there's a lot of competition, even we'll say within industries, even as sad as it is, even within, we'll say, the environmental community in Sri Lanka. There is a lot of action that's happening, but it's a lot of action happening in silos, and there has to be everyone largely is working towards, we'll say within the environmental community, towards one goal. And it would be good to have more collaboration across the table. A lot of countries will say have learned lessons from other countries and adopted them in their countries to handle the pandemic. Very similarly, I would suggest that we need to collaborate more with people, look at cooperation. Those are really key pillars in moving forward.
Thanks, Vinod. Um, Dr. Mandi, you talked a little bit about localization, regionalization. I'd like to move focus now. Which one do you think is going to prevail post-COVID? Do you think that the world is going to become more localized or more regionalized, or continue to be globalized?
Good question, Nero, because it all depends on how we are going to address the lessons that we have learned from COVID-19. As I mentioned before, if we are going to go back to business as usual, I'm very sure very soon all the localized solutions that we've been talking will vanish, and that we will go back to the globalized situation, and that the capitalism will prevail. But I think if a country is smart enough, if a government is wanting to take a step forward to become smarter, resilient, not just to the climate change, even to the pandemics, that they would understand it's important to develop and promote and nurture the localized solutions. Because locally, when you are sustainable, when you are empowered, it's very easy to address the regional and the global issues. Yet, which path are we going to take? That's a really, really difficult question. But I really think the answer lies in one fact. I mentioned earlier that this is a time where everyone listens to scientists. I think that should be the way. I'm not talking about just scientists. I think those who can present things with evidences, those who have the facts, those who can project what's going to happen if you take different pathways. So to do that, what you need is learned mindsets in every platform, from policymakers to the politicians to the administrators, and even at the local level, good dialogues. So if we create that platform, I'm very sure that every country will be sensible enough to look for localized solutions while making sure the country remains globalized for certain aspects, which is quite essential. So, I mean, it's up to us at the end of the day. But, honestly, I'm lost for an answer. But I hope that we take the localized approach while being globalized for certain aspects.
Understood. And thank you for clarifying. What about yourself? What do you think is going to happen, once we fight our way out of this pandemic? Do you think we're going to become more localized, become regionalized, or continue to be as globalized as we are, and more so afterwards?
I think aspects of our economy will become localized, and I certainly do hope so. That is the way forward. But I also think regionalism can be something that's important, because we'll say with COVID, it's been a global pandemic, and why we could say the climate crisis doesn't get the attention it should is because a lot of the issues, like we'll say the forest fires, they say in Australia, that's in Australia, where over here in Sri Lanka doesn't really affect us. But when we looked at the forest fires there, New Zealand was affected because they're like very close to each other. So there is regional. So anything we'll say happening even in the Bay of Bengal, some of the countries in that area will be affected over here. So regionalization, regional support as well is necessary, I would say. And then I think coming back to this idea of like us all being connected, I think we can never forget that at the end of the day, we are global citizens, and we all do live here on this one earth. So everyone has to have that view as well. So it's the not in my backyard syndrome has to kind of leave people's perceptions and ideas, and people have to start really realizing that the that the effects of that the actions that they take on a day-to-day basis do have trickle down repercussions for someone else. So yeah, I really hope that people do look locally for certain things, as well as, but continue to also have this global vision.
Thanks, Vinod. I think you're quite right. People used to think that climate change was happening to someone over there until they realized that it's happening here to us. Vidura, what about yourself? Do you think that we're going to be localized, regionalized, or globalized in the wake of this pandemic?
I think we are going to be globalized for. I don't think that is changing. How this globalization works, we may have a reset. It depends. I would say how we would look at this will depend on how fast the vaccine would come. If there's a mass vaccine in 6 months, I can guarantee you everybody will forget whether COVID existed or not and go back to our very own ways. And let me give you a very interesting piece of news I picked up today. Carnival cruise ships. Now, I thought the cruise ship industry is going to be the worst hit and it will never survive because it's an industry of excess and there are too many horror stories of people dying on cruise ships. Carnival cruise ship industry company just announced that they will start ships in US from summer, and their bookings is 600%. They flooded with bookings. This summer in US, where the death rates and infection rate is not going to stop. So and this is supposed to be a whole bunch of young people and corporate clients who are saying, okay, it's not going to affect us. So I think we need to be very, very cautious in taking overly optimistic messaging out of this. And this is my view. The part about globalization is, I think the mode of how we work has shifted because we are so comfortable with Zoom right now. It's just that it asks some questions about how we need to travel, how much we need to travel, but our interconnection level at a global scale has not changed, and it will continue. We just there may be for a particular period of time where the travel will be limited, but my guess is that we'll come into a new normal. Hopefully not as much excess as we used to. But again, vaccine will determine how bad it is.
Right. Regarding the bookings for US holidaymakers, I'm interested to see the demand is obviously there. I wonder whether they'll be able to, how many of those bookings they'll actually be able to honor in that that time period. Vidura, firstly, I'd like to mention to the audience that please do ask questions. Use the question and answer function at the bottom right-hand corner of the application. We'll be starting to take questions in about 15 minutes. But Vidura, I'd like, in the meantime, over the years, environmentally conscious investments have been economically viable. That's been proven multiple times over. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, material efficiency, so on and so forth. With these initiatives ticking many boxes, particularly if you're looking at triple bottom line relevant stuff, why do you think there hasn't been greater traction thus far?
That's a tough question. I think I've seen many reasons given. I can't give you a conclusive one. Certain things, the economics have changed. Say, for example, definitely on the energy side, renewable energy has beaten all fossil fuels hands down. We just saw recently concluded, just 2 days ago, the last solar plus storage tender for 24-hour storage. Okay, so it's a round-the-clock power plant in India, 400 megawatts. Contract price was Sri Lankan rupees, 7 rupees and 16 cents. Okay, you can't do anything at that price for a unit of electricity. So the economics are completely different. But But we've got quite a lot of systems inertia and people not willing to explore and change. So I would put not willing to explore and change as the number one reason why things don't change. We are very used to doing things the way it used to be. We don't sometimes understand the kind of disruptive change that is happening alongside us with respect to technology. So that I have seen in some instances. I think the second one I would say is that I think we as a humanity lacks the understanding of environmental issues and the seriousness of what scientists like Dr. Sewan, the climate scientists, what they are saying about biodiversity, ecology, and environment and climate change. If you don't really understand the scale of the problem, and if we are not moved to do that, we wouldn't even look at something that we could purchase which has a lower environmental harm than the other one. So in the world that I work in, the question always is that, is the consumer really interested in this? Do people want to buy more sustainable, more ecological sound products? Or is it that we want to claim we are trying to be more ecologically sustainable, but really wants the cheapest deal around, right? We can ask things. I mean, we don't need to. We can ask even very simple things about what we consume. Are we giving priority in our own lives to organically grown vegetables versus chemically grown? Where are our eggs coming from? At what, if we eat meat, under what conditions that meat is grown? How many of us are aware that there is a problem and make choices? Okay, and I'm not asking everybody to become vegan and organic, okay, because this is not affordable at this point of time for a lot of people. But out of which can you change one purchasing decision? Buy one vegetable, buy two vegetables, depending on your capacity from organic. And that type of shift can change the complete marketplace. But to do that, you have to have that consciousness saying that, it's always, I mean, I had this friend of mine who was an environmental activist who was asking, why do we put a qualifier to organic vegetables? One is a vegetable, other is a chemically grown vegetable, right? But we put the adjective in front of organic. So, that's not true. That is the vegetable. The other one is a chemically grown one. It's not good for you. And it's not agrochemicals, it's poison. So there is something about how we use language embedded into that as well. And we talk about this ecological way of consumption and ecological way of living as something different from normal. And I think this is what Dr. Sewan started with. The way we were living was normal, not normal. We were living abnormal lifestyles, and we would want to start calling that an abnormal lifestyle. And eating organic vegetables is actually the normal. Now, how do we change our economic model where the organically grown vegetables and crops become the normal and chemical become the abnormal, is the billion-dollar question. I know last government tried to push organic agriculture. The current government is trying to push it, but it's a brick wall.
Really, really very thought-provoking statements, Dr. Vidura. Dr. Sewandi, anything that you'd like to add to Vidura's statement there?
Few things. One very big problem that we are having at the moment to bring in what we environmentalists call normal is that the right infrastructure is not there to place the normal things. Let it be organic vegetables, let it be anything that is ecologically and environmentally sustainable and viable, because they don't fit into the conventional economic models. So that's one problem. And at the same time, we also live in an environment where we have not placed a value to these things. Forget about eating healthy things, but what about our lifestyle itself? Now, at the wake of COVID-19, everyone started talking about immunity. But think about Nero, the importance of living with nature, giving environment a chance to give you diseases, but to improve your immunity naturally to build up the resilience. But we were not there. We were a nation that was addicted to antibiotics, pills, so on and so forth. So when a pandemic came and knocked at your door, then only we started talking about how do we become resilient and sort of like uh, take care of ourselves. What is required is, I think, to create a dialogue. You all can do it. Create a dialogue. What is normal living? What is normal lifestyle? What is deemed to be normal? Because I don't think it's easy to get away from what we now call normal, but really abnormal. And that requires a greater dialogue, not just for the children, not just for the current population, but also along with the with the policymakers, with the with those who take decisions. So what is required is maybe we can take this as a chance to create that consciousness, to ensure that we become a healthy nation, take the right decisions. Not easy, yet I think the right platform has been created thanks to COVID-19. So many things can be done, and a large chunk of it is advocacy, right attitude creation, right diplomacy, and I think media has a big role there, Niru. And I think time to start.
Thank you, Dr. Sewandi. Vinod, I'd like to talk to you about tourism, unless you would like to add anything to Dr. Vidura and Dr. Sewandi's statements just now.
No, I'm all good. I think they covered it, Nero.
Okay. So regarding tourism, tourism's played a significant role in providing revenue for Sri Lanka. And many policymakers in the past have focused on developing what is essentially mass market tourism, using probably a template from the 1970s and 80s, which is probably the most impactful, form of tourism, mass market tourism, just because of the volumes that of people that you're moving around. I'd like to talk a little bit more with you about sustainable and experiential tourism, and to see what ideas can emerge from that, so that policymakers can potentially plan better and deploy more sustainable policies moving forward.
Interesting to Nero, like with mass market tourism, you talked about impact, and it's who actually who are the benefactors of these impacts. It is the large mass market audiences, like the big hotel chains are the people that are the big winners in that sort of model. But if you look at Sri Lanka, interestingly, we've been 2019 Lonely Planet named Sri Lanka as #1 travel destination. What is Lonely Planet? It's more of an experiential travel guide for people. So it's looking at people who come, ride the train, want to eat at the roti shop, go around. That people are coming to experience Sri Lanka. If you look at a lot of the videos floating around on the internet about Sri Lanka, it's always, that's what we portray. And even the SLTDA has been pushing this idea as of late of coming to Sri Lanka, experience in Sri Lanka. So I guess the question has to be, how can we move forward in a way where we're not undermining the very things that are driving Sri Lanka to this position as such a exotic or such a interesting travel destination, appealing, if you will, for people to come to. We need to stop undermining those and really embrace it. Costa Rica's done it in one sense. That could be a case study we can look at, and understand if nature-based tourism or adventure tourism is the road we want to go down, we need to stop undermining the very things that are propelling us to that.
Thanks, Vinod. I'm not sure if we actually have the economies of scale in Sri Lanka to cater to mass market tourism the way that, for example, Thailand does. We're a much smaller nation, which are largely dependent on imports for a variety of our materials. There has been a number of successful models in the boutique hotel business that are either, middle market or budget or even luxury. So all ends of the market can be catered to with a smaller scale of operation, which actually doesn't require the amount of capital investment in the infrastructure. And I want to talk to Dr. Vidura a little bit about, the infrastructure that's required for for mass market tourism, and how we can relook at the infrastructure to be able to, using the infrastructure that we already have to cater to an existing tourism market who's actually probably more interested in visiting Sri Lanka in its current state than it being, the Thailand or the Singapore or a different model.
Well, I'm not a tourism specialist, but I always felt that the experiential tourist market probably is what is there, but I don't know whether the industry as a whole accepts that. And I think it's a kind of quite interesting dilemma, because it's easy to tap into mass market tourism, even for a small organization or a small house owner on the beach through Airbnb. It's convenient. And experiential tourism requires more entrepreneurial skill to construct something, and I'm not sure how we are as a country to do that. But I don't think the current model that we have is really sustainable. You just can't move people around at that scale and talk about sustainability at the same time. So I think we have a fundamental dilemma, and I sense that tourism sector will be impacted more than other sectors. So how do we reinvent ourselves? Because mass market for me in the next 2 years, unless again a mass vaccine comes, is not going to really materialize. So what do we do with the existing assets? How do we convert them into something much more different? And really, how do we reset ourselves into a different frame? Is a question that I think as a country we need to ask, and the tourism industry by themselves need to ask. What is the future sustainable model?
Okay, I've also noticed that you mentioned vaccine a couple of times. I'm not going to talk about vaccines on this particular discussion. But COVID showed us that if the stakes are high enough, then we're prepared to change.
Mm-hmm.
Vidura, do you think that COVID-19 was enough of a catalyst to actually get people to think differently and act differently? And how do you think we will start to see, how and when do you think we'll start to see that paradigm shift?
Well, my wife really doesn't like revolutions. And the point she's saying is that revolution brings about change, but not necessarily the one you want. So you can say I'm skeptical, I'm suspicious about a single event going to cause a fundamental rethink, because that's not economic inertia, the system and structural inertia work, in my opinion. I think it's a long-term gradual development of, grassroots level, consciousness building level, transitioning innovative and entrepreneurial businesses, citizen activism. All of those components are needed for sustainable change, right? We ourselves have, if you look at the last 30, 40 years, how many revolutions we've had in different countries? And did they all end up in a better place? I don't think so. So I think asking, in a way, it's about denialism. If you are saying, we've been all much in denial all this time, COVID is going to wake us up and then we are going to work different. I honestly don't think that's going to work, right? I think people who understood a wider picture has an even more larger role to play, and we need to build more coalitions. As Vinod said, we need collaboration. If we see the problem, we need to get on the ground, put our bodies on the line. And that's what climate scientists are already doing, and biodiversity specialists are already doing in indigenous communities, in front of coal mines. We need people who have understood this problem to take action, not just become in our nice ivory towers of scientists or academia or wherever we are, right? Sri Lanka is quite interesting in that sense because we have a very, very small number of committed environmental activists who have done something much bigger than what their capable strength has been to keep this country in this level, right? But we cannot do this. The task that is in front of us is much bigger. There's bigger mobilization is needed. We need to start talking to people so that they change their perspectives, and we need real action on the ground. It's not going to happen just because COVID came and went.
Noted. Thank you, Vidura. I'm going to start reading out the questions from the audience. And the first question is to Dr. Sewandi. We are over-reliant on global supply chains, and Dr. Sewandi has also mentioned the same. This is a time that we need to think more local, but how will this affect the revenue that Sri Lanka earns from exports, and what form will this take in the next normal?
A very interesting question, because yes, exports are quite important, but at the same time we have to also look at how much we invest on imports. Most of the products that we produce in Sri Lanka depend on imports from elsewhere. Even some really smaller things, we do them because we import things from elsewhere and then we export. Yet, I think we have the capacity to produce few things. It can be as simple as production of a nut and bolt rather than depending on another region to bring it in. To start with, yes, there will be certain problems. Maybe there will be a decline of income. Yet I think as you become more sustainable and as you become stronger in terms of your local production, I think it will come to a tip-off point where things will balance off. I'm not an economist, but I think we have enough models which we have very clearly seen. When a country invests on its natural resources, protection, plus sustainable use, that country becomes stronger, not just socially, but also economically. So, though I really don't have a real answer, I think this is a gamble that we need to take while we continue some of the models with the existing infrastructure, time to venture for other economic models like what I mentioned just before.
Thank you, Dr. Sewandi. The next question is for Vinod. I hear that the current PPE are adding so much to ocean plastic and landfills. How can we swiftly mitigate this now that we are settling down to a situation where PPE is here to stay?
Niro, I mean, very tough question. I would say, I mean, many short-term emergency measures taken will become a fixture of our lives for a little bit. I mean, that simply is the nature of emergencies. So decisions that will say, even decision making, normal time that it would have taken, people would have deliberated for years, have been made in a couple of hours. How do we go forward? I would say, as Vidura pointed out, we need to be open to more ideas, explore options that are all on the table, try to better understand, what's out there, and be open to new mindsets, because this is obviously a new normal that none of us have really experienced, locally or globally. So looking for collaborative approaches, being open, are some of the ways that we could potentially mitigate the impacts of what we're seeing from COVID.
Thank you, Vinod. The next question is to Vidura from Shevanti Fernando. When it comes to climate action, what national policy level changes would we need to take to catalyze some of the changes that you advocate here?
Thank you, Shevanti, for the question. Can I just touch on 2 points on the 2 previous questions. One is as Dr. Sevandi correctly pointed out, the economic model. We actually, through local production, reduce our imports. We don't need to export so much. That's one. And PPE is actually quite a lot of the personal protective equipment that we use, like the face mask, can be actually made from biodegradable components. So the ocean plastic problem may not be as significant as that. Coming back to climate, I think we need to start from policy, because we honestly don't have a very convincing climate change policy. If you really look at the policy making process, it's not geared towards a particular outcome. We really don't have a clear climate change action plan, whether it's mitigation or whether it's adaptation, right? If you look at some of the development projects and how we are approaching this, you just wonder whether people actually understand climate change impacts in our country. And even the well-intentioned policies are being stymied at implementation. And I'll give you a good example. The renewable energy policies of successive governments have been completely blocked. The last government's target was 50% in 2030. The current government's target is 80% in 2030. And we have a utility who's saying we have to reduce our renewable energy percentage from 40% to 35% by 2030. So we have it's going completely the opposite way that the policy dictates and the global trend, right? In some ways, we have to start putting more emphasis, as they keep saying, into science. And we need to really understand from a climate change point of view, from a mitigation side, what is it that we can do? And how do we get to that in a very expedited manner? On an adaptation point of view, we need to ask questions like, what are the real impacts that are coming into play that is going to have a serious repercussions into our ecology and to our lives? And how do we try to build infrastructure that can survive this? Now, I'm going to tell you that this is more or less an impossible task unless collectively the whole world comes together on addressing climate change. I don't know if you saw about it. There was last week a research paper came out where they actually analyzed, if we don't make a substantial change in our global emissions trajectory, the average temperature in most of Sri Lanka, except for the Central Highlands, will be 29 degrees Celsius. Okay, that means the daytime temperature is going to be significantly higher. And average temperature 29 Celsius at present is actually Sahara Desert. And this is the projection that we are talking about. So if this is business as usual scenario, putting climate change into action in our country as a policy priority would require us to ask fundamental questions, everything from our wildlife to our agriculture to our industry, and ask how we're going to be in this reality. And that, unfortunately, is not there. And we have a climate change strategy which is actually beholden to other departments privileging their priorities, as opposed to putting that into the center. Whereas we have to have climate influence strategies in our industrial ministry. We need to have climate influence strategies in our poverty alleviation processes, climate influence strategies in our tourism industry, or in our manufacturing industry, or in the electricity utility, or in our transport policy. But what are we doing? We are building roads. Where are our trains? Where is the electrification of transportation? Where is the renewable push into our energy system? Where is the push to bring low carbon fuels to power up our industry? Where is our serious adaptation plan? How are we going to protect our water systems? How are we going to protect our coastal communities? How are we going to protect our the remnants of coral reefs and seagrass beds that we already have? right? And you know, the irony of it is we talk about tourism that is built around our natural heritage, but I haven't seen tourism industry taking a strong stand on climate change or biodiversity loss. They're very busy building hotels. I haven't seen any industry come together and put climate change at the center of their conversation. And this from a country which is very, very highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. Sorry for that long rant, but
no, that's certainly not a rant. Or, lots of food for thought. You had my mind racing actually on so many things. It's quite incredible that the environment has not been placed at the forefront of almost every decision in every industry across the board. I mean, it's one of those amalgamating. Well, it's probably one of the few amalgamating, factors that we have that ties everything together. So it's interesting to see how it's been overlooked for so long.
So there's one more question, Niro, if you don't mind, I'll take Samita's question as well. And the question reads, if you do manage to take action in time, will the world be magically saved? Will forests be replenished? Will the Arctic stop melting? So I'm going to give, Samita, I'm going to give you the really bad news. The Arctic will not stop melting. It will stop melting, but if you think about ice sheet dynamics, whether it's in the Arctic or the glaciers or Antarctic, we talk about their system inertia in hundreds of years, in centuries. So the current trend of warming and melting of both Antarctic and Arctic will not stop, at least for 300 years, even if we get our act together. We are going to see an ice-free Arctic in the summer within the next 15 to 20 years. It's a given. There's nothing we can do to stop that. Some of the forests will come back. It depends on what we do. And the real question I would ask is this. That is not a cause for not action. That's a cause for more urgent action. Because we may not be able to save some things, but we are able to save a lot of things, other things. And we have to change to make the ecology viable on the planet. It's not about humans. We are a small part of it. It's really about what is our role as part of ecology. We like to say we are above ecology because that's why we are trying to save it now. What is our role as part of ecology? And what is our role in a more than human world? To me, this is the fundamental question we need to answer. And our actions and how we think about the way we live has to come from that type of a root in the middle. And that's the only way to be sustainable.
Thank you, Vidura. I have a question here from Facebook Live. Sri Lanka has corruption and the lack of transparency, accountability, and professionalism in decision-making and project approvals, backed by effectively implemented policies and priorities which have led to environmental degradation. This is an open question to any one of the panelists who would like to volunteer and take it forward. Tough question, right?
I'd like to add a few things to that. Now, yes, corruption is there, not just in Sri Lanka, but also in many other places. But why is corruption happening? Corruption can happen in any place when we are not sensitive to that. So if we have people around us who are mindful about what policymakers, what developers, what administrators do, it's very difficult for them to be corrupt. Our problem is here in Sri Lanka, not the absence of rules and regulations, policies, so on and so forth. To be frank, if you compare Sri Lanka with the rest of Asia, we have really good systems to take care of our environment and to do development at the same time. For an example, IE, EIA, environmental assessments, they are all in place. But the problem is that at the moment, they've become mere documents that you have to prepare in order to move forward. Most of the problems that we've been talking here, let it be climate change, let it be the carbon that we emit, let it be the fragmentation that we do in our forests to come up with new development, let it be running from one tourism location to the other after destroying one place. All these things are happening because we've not been doing environmental assessment properly, not giving due attention to it, and especially public not being very attentive to these things. So I think part of the problem is that we are silent, and I think we need to take matters to our hand to make sure that you raise your voice and is aware about these issues. Once you live in a society like that, people are afraid to be corrupt. I do agree, but I also want to tell everyone that the system is there, making the wheels turn, and to ensure that wheels turn in the right direction is in our hands. So that can be done, and that should be done. It's because nature is not going to give us alternatives all the time, Nero. The problem is that, as everyone said, we've been doing business as usual because we always had been having the mercy of the nature. For an example, when sort of Unawatu down south, coral reefs were destroyed because of tourism, we moved elsewhere. Once Noor area and all that mountain areas were sort of like became unattractive, ecologically unsustainable, we moved to Aller. But how long can we go on doing these things? And where will the alternatives stop? And those are the ideas that we need to build into our development and also to industries, not to look for alternatives, but to live sustainably in one location. And with that, I think to a certain extent, we can even stop corruption.
Dr. Sewandi, thank you very, very much. And thank you to all the panelists. I hope that policymakers within the government, leaders from the private sector, and individuals watching this from home take some of the suggestions on board. And we sincerely hope that your thoughts have been provoked. We hope that you have been inspired, you have been given some suggestions to make some changes and look at things differently. I suppose it's a time that we either change or we are changed. So on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Sewandi Jayakodi, Director, EFL, Dr. Vidura Valapanava, Environment and Sustainability Expert. Thank you also to Vinod Malvatta, Executive Director of the Lanka Environment Fund. Thank you to Chandra Jayaratna, our rapporteur, who has joined us very patiently and has been supporting us in the background. Thank you also very much to the Newsfirst team. And most importantly, thank you to the audience that has been listening and watching this show. And we hope to see you on the next episode. Thank you very much and good night.